I know people have asked this question before, and it's not an easy answer, but when we're designing a headphone, what do we listen for? Like, what are we listening for, right, when we are doing R&D or whatever it is, this magic stuff we do to make a headphone sound the way it does?
Well, I guess it starts out with like a design goal, right?
Yeah.
So you have like an intended thing you're looking for in a specific new model, and you try to go in that direction.
Yeah.
So,
but where do you get this intent?
Well,
yeah, you got to know what that intended thing sounds like, right? I guess that's the key, though, right? It really is when you think about it, right? It's like you do have to have an audible goal. Like you got to know.
That's very helpful.
You're working off of all other things you've heard or listened to in the past, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Or designed yourself. Like, yeah, we got data from everything we made, so that helps too. You kind of already know where you're kind of gonna be from the start.
So I think what that means is you try to fill a need that is in the market that currently isn't filled. And it could just be a different sound for your same model headphone or whatever, but making the same thing twice doesn't really make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, right. In a marketplace full of same things, it wouldn't make any sense.
Because there's plenty of variation, and that's sort of one of the positive things about this hobby. But no sense in making the same thing twice. So you kind of got to discover, well, what haven't we done before? What's like a minor shift or whatever that would be interesting, that would be, for whatever reason, more exciting now than ever. Maybe you learn something in developing another headphone that you could apply to this headphone. You'd be like, you know what, actually, this will give us a cooler sound or whatever. It'll give you something that's exciting or interesting.
And you said minor shift, and that's kind of true when you think about it. It's like, if you already have a focus, your company already has a focus, and you have established clientele, you have people that love what you do, right? You're not going to like throw shit can the whole thing and come up with something.
I mean,
completely
sometimes
wild.
that happens, but yeah, it's kind of like the 911. They've been working on it for 60 years or whatever,
right?
And they've changed it a lot. Like you look at the first one to currently,
it's a
lot different, but the whole idea has been the same the whole time,
right?
Well, the idea is pretty straightforward, which I guess we should cover. Of course, the goal is always to make the best headphone. And this is a very complicated thing because it turns out the actual target sound that people want isn't well identified. It's very complicated and nuanced. It depends on the price.
It's a variable.
The competitors at the time.
And it keeps moving.
Right.
The goalpost keeps moving
always.
On this because the headphone's not just in and of itself, right, just sits there in the marketplace by itself. It's surrounded by gear. It's surrounded by music, the content, where you get your music from, what you're listening to. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of variables.
And they're all changing all the time.
Yeah, big time,
So it's very hard to just say, oh, this is how it should sound, because if that's the case, then someone would have made the best headphone ever, and there's no point for any of us to exist past that. But luckily enough, that's not the case. There very much is a continual evolution in both marketplace demands and desires, and needs to some extent as the things you're talking about changes, as the amps and the source and stuff changes or improves. That's primarily what we see. Things change somewhere, and you're like, hey, now it makes more sense to make a sound that's more like this or whatever, to make it more detailed.
And part of our process in listening to what we're designing is using different gear. We don't use one amplifier for everything. That would be almost silly, And
for a lot of it you do, but then you're like, all right, now we got to start trying different stuff once you get closer to what you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
But I think, like, especially with like MR, we were the most constrained than we've been usually because we wanted to keep impedance low. Normally we're like, well, we'll just whatever the impedance ends up being. All right, that's what it had to be, right? But
right.
In this case, we had a target, and luckily, as we got closer to it, it actually hit it. So.
Yeah, impedance was at the top of the list. It's like, let's make this thing as low as possible so that it plays nice with battery operated.
It's a different approach than we've ever had, and we haven't spoken about it yet, so I guess we cover it a little bit. So with MR, the goal was to have the lowest impedance we could get away with, and of course, we still wanted it to be a good sounding headphone, and of course, there was a sonic target for that model as well.
And by get away with, you should probably define that where, if you go too low, you start to choke off some amplifiers. Right. They just can't handle it. We've seen some headphones that hit 10 ohms or something like that.
There's a compromise all around.
And it's like, well,
you don't want to go below 20 something because you start to run into issues, but it depends on the amps you're intending to plug into and stuff.
Yeah.
But Also, the low impedance you go for the given size, it tends to mean the more metals on the diaphragm, which tends to mean it's higher mass, which isn't necessarily bad, but of course, everything's always a combination of the skills you have at the time, the materials you have available to you, and whatnot, and you use these things to try to achieve your goals. And with MR, the goal was low impedance with high fidelity.
So once we did that, now next came measurements. We're like, all right, we figured out how to get the impedance low on this particular driver. Now we need to optimize the driver for a low distortion and frequency response.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the measurements came in. And I mean, we spent a lot of time on that. Fortunately, we have the 5128 now, and it's a microscope for measurement, so it's nice to be able to use a tool like
Well,
that.
and more importantly, it's very consistent, measurement to measurement.
Right.
So if we can rely on it, that's like you're not guessing the measurement.
Yeah, you throw the headphone in the booth on the head, close the door, bam, you got a measurement. And I mean, and if we see something weird, we'll take another one or two or three just to make sure it isn't
Yeah,
a test
AC
set.
kicking on or whatever.
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
But you never know.
Yeah.
Or somebody just hit the door, slammed the door somewhere.
Yeah.
But bottom line is that the measurements are so consistent, and it's easy to tell on a granular sense what's going on. And we've probably went through, I don't know, how many hundreds of freaking driver iterations. I don't even know.
Well, the first ones weren't numbered, so
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we skipped like 20.
we ended up on 86, but
Yeah.
we had many that weren't numbered.
Yeah.
It was about 100 or so.
Yeah, the different iterations of a similar driver, just minor changes, and it allows us to hone in on extremely low distortion and frequency response. And then ultimately, when we're done, when we've satisfied ourselves, right, which is rarely the case, but at some point you just got to say, okay, this is really good enough, And I mean, it gets to a point too where it's like, you could do this for years, which we have done for 10 years, right? And that's the thing, is like we've done this for so long now that you kind of already know what we need to do to get to where we're going.
Well, like Diana TC helped because we already kind of did that with the same equipment, so we already kind of knew where we were going.
Yeah.
But it was different driver, so yeah, we had to do it again. But we had a pretty well understood starting point. So.
Yeah, that was an exhaustive. Diana TC was an exhaustive thing to do in terms of optimizing a driver, but
MR wasn't too far off.
No.
Yeah, no, it wasn't.
Well,
yeah.
we thought it was going to be easier than it was.
Yeah,
but
agreed. Yeah, and the secondary goals we wanted to fill out the base a bit, and the bottom end a bit, and it's not really done by I would call a measurement means. It's more or less part of the design of the diaphragm and the driver and the interior space, So, and the reason for that being is because, if we're touting this as being a portable headphone, right, and it's being operated on battery operated gear, a lot of that stuff doesn't have the grunt force that a desktop amp will have.
Yeah.
So we wanted to make sure that Diana can play through that, without sounding lean.
For the most part, our steps pretty much start with getting the trace design pretty much finalized, and we do that primarily based off the distortion measurements. Of course, checking up on other measurements along the way to ensure that there's no questionable impacts, but primarily distortion. And once we're set with that, now we have a driver that's as optimized as we think feasible for the design goals, but it still doesn't sound quite right. So now we need to move on to the tuning, the acoustic portions.
Yes, we need to listen to the thing.
Right.
Who would have thought?
Well, you could just not.
Well, you could, yeah, that's true. There are probably some companies that do that. You don't need to hear it. It's not measured.
You can kind of get away with it, but there's a lot of trivial nuance when you actually make the change and you hear it. When you go look back at the measurements, you could barely see it. It's so incredibly difficult to pull that information out of the little squiggles. But you could hear a lot of times in certain regions, you could hear very big differences, audibly, that you could barely see at all in the measurement.
You start changing the interior acoustics. Some companies play with absorption. You could play with reflections, interior reflections, the materials that are used inside, if any. The shape of the interior, the cuts. In your case, you CNC. We were CNCing out of aluminum, so we can change. You can change the cut patterns, the interior spacings.
There was a lot of that on MR, more than I thought. It's like it might look the same on the outside, but inside it's completely different.
Yeah, and you're going to do a video soon on that, showing all the not all of it, but a lot of the changes and even reasons why. But it's a crazy complex scheme interior. And the funny thing is it's not funny, it's true, is we hear the changes. We can hear that. And like you said, they're very difficult to quantify in the measurements because they're so subtle that you don't know, even if you do see a tenth of a dB change somewhere in a freq response in a certain narrow band of range, doesn't tell you if you're going to like how it sounds or if it's better or worse, because it's all relative to the whole overall sound of the headphone.
Yeah, you know? And particularly with MR, we wanted like a solid foundation of bass. We were not mainly, but really looking at the bass and how it sounded. And in terms of measurements, like the bass region, it doesn't really measure any different than a Diana TC in the bass.
Right.
But they don't sound the same in the bass, so.
Yeah, we were after like more of a punch and a fullness down there, you know, and and we accomplished that in MR, and again, it's done by tuning, and unfortunately it's outside the scope of the measurements, so to speak, you know, because it does
frequency response.
Yeah, at least the frequency response. Yeah, so that's a difficult thing to explain, and that comes from experience. You know, because we've all listened to music on stereo systems and stuff our whole lives. Pretty much, you know. I might have started when I was 12, but you guys had music since you were born because I had it. Mm. So, you know, we all are accustomed to having good systems. So, you know, when we're tuning something in the final tuning, it's a matter of, it's an abstract. You're looking at, right, what do we feel that the customer's preferences are going to be overall for this headphone, and we shoot for that goal.
Yeah, well, you needed a little nudging, though, because you always kept wanting to go towards Diana TC. It's like, oh, this is what I'm used to, right?
Right.
I'm like, well, we don't want to make a Diana TC.
Or 1266.
Yeah, right. It's like, no.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I keep trying to
It's kind of hard sometimes, yeah.
I kept trying to get to the 1266 with a big tube amp, you know, and it's like, well, that's tough to do with a compact headphone on a solid state dongle. But it's close. I mean, it's pretty good. You know?
Yeah, they're all very similar enough. When you compare between the lines, it's not like it's that big of a leap compared to what you could get when you go from like one brand headphone to a totally different brand headphone, or a planar magnetic to a dynamic or something.
Yeah, everybody will hear it and be like,
it's not crazy, but it definitely has a different sound. And I think it's reasonable to do that. Like, that seems like a sensible thing to do. I think we talked about this many times. Making different products that are unique and interesting. It seems like what people want and what I personally want in a product like that.
But it's the classic thing that happens every time we do this. Like, here, listening to stuff all day, you know, developing a new product. Then I go home and I don't have one yet because we didn't finish it.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm listening to what I usually listen to, and I'm like, oh, this is different. And then I was listening to all day today.
Yeah.
You kind of like miss it, you know. Then it's like, oh.
Did you take one of those home? I don't even have one yet.
I don't have one. No.
We haven't used it. I took it home to try it on the Lena, on the Woo W33. Right. I tried it on DCS stuff, and it sounds really good on it. But
I've had it at home for a couple of days, but I just bring it back the next day.
I had to bring it back.
Well, it's like the development one, you know.
Yeah, right. So. Well, now that's turning into production. So we're making them now, and we're starting the process.
Yes. Soon we will have many.
Yeah. I think we're waiting on the case. We're still waiting on the cases. We spent a little too much time developing the case for it, so they're coming. We're waiting.
Hopefully a few weeks.
Yeah, we should have it in a few weeks, and we're good to go. So, hope you enjoy this one. If you have any questions about how we design things, send us a message or email.
Yeah,
we'll try to help. We'll try to talk about it if we can. You know, it's tough in an email, but maybe we'll do another video on something if someone comes up with a better,
you could do
some question. Yeah, you could always give it. We're always looking for ideas here.
Yeah.
So what to talk about.
Yeah, we'll say the words.
Yeah. And it's easy to talk about because we all lived it. Right? We did all of it ourselves. So
yeah. So there you go. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourselves.